Okay. Hi, everybody. You might not know who I am. I'm Emily. I work on the marketing team at Flatiron School, and I'm here to introduce you to Melody, who is a former head of product at Blue Apron. She is going to share a bit more about her journey, how she got there, a tiny amount about what she maybe is up to next, and then we'll just open it up for your questions. So without further ado, we'll get started.
Cool. Does this work? Hi. Yeah? Okay. So I'm Melody Ko. LinkedIn says I'm still head of product at Blue Apron, but I left a month ago, and I'm going to be announcing what I'm going to do next week. But not going to be in product management anymore and going back to venture capital investing. So more specifics coming in next week. Apologize, can't share more. But just quick background on myself. So I've been at Blue Apron for 3.5 years. Started out as their first PM when the company was about 20 people, year and a half in, 4 developers, there's no like engineer management, there's no scrum process, there's no sprint, there's no roadmap, no designers. So it was a fascinating journey from the first product hire to then I start taking on product management team, then start taking on product design team, build out that team, and then took on analytics, so data science, BI, predictive analytics, and operational reporting last year. So when I left, I handed out a team of 35 people back to our CTO founder. So it's been a really fascinating journey, both in terms of individual product management work, as well as building teams, and obviously collaborating very closely with our engineer organization, engineer leadership, and right before I left, VP of Eng that we've had at Blue Apron, as well as the entire engineering management team. Before that, I actually got my first product stint at fab.com. For those of you who don't know, Fab was, had at the time, the fastest growing e-commerce company in New York, raised a ton of money, burned through a ton of money. I joined towards the tail end, basically a month after they closed their last round of financing, before their sudden, I describe it as a Titanic kind of hit the iceberg. I joined right before we approached the iceberg, obviously without knowing that we're going to hit the iceberg. So it was fascinating, but it was really good training for me. We had a 6-person product team and 120 engineers in Pune, India. So I had to work with the team remote. Blue Apron team was all local in New York, but the Fab experience was really good, kind of first foray into formal product management for me. Before that, I was in business school at HBS and actually did a project for Adam for Flatiron School of Flatiron, which is opening up. It was his first class. I remember an independent study I did help them think through, I don't know how much they actually leveraged from my school project, but with a few classmates, we were working on how to kind of placement strategy and interviewed a bunch of CTOs in New York and Boston. But most of my time at HBS was working on my own company. It was an e-commerce subscription service for personalized wine delivery. And for anybody who ever want to go into wine, don't do it. It's really complicated. A lot of operational challenges and regulatory hurdles, but I like wine, and I decided that 3 weeks after going to business school, I decided that I want to work on it. Never had any formal product training, but I was with a classmate of mine. I was a co-founder who was responsible for product marketing and talking to VCs because I had venture capital background. Worked on it for a year with launched the beta side with outsourced engineering team. And after that, reflecting on that, decided that I wanted to learn how to actually build software. So that's why I go into product management after school. Early in my career, I actually done venture capital at Time Warner, the media company, and we have a 5-person group that does strategic investments in anything digital media. So done a ton of work in advertising technology, gaming, anything content, and digital media related stuff. I started out my career in investment banking. So I had a pretty formal finance training from undergrad. So with that, yeah, just kind of the quick rundown, and happy to talk about anything, how to work with product managers, designers, really anything that touches on any part of my personal background and past experience. Happy to chat about. What was needed first? What was needed first? Kind of question. All right, here we go.
You mentioned that in New York, working with Blue Apron, everyone's local, but oh, sorry.
I can hear, yeah, but
Okay.
other people might not.
You mentioned in New York, everyone in Blue Apron is local, and then in the other company, which I'm forgetting already,
Fab, yeah.
at Fab, 120 developers in India. Can you speak to the differences in those experiences?
Yeah, it was from a product manager's perspective, but it was working with any kind of team, engineering team that's not local was not ideal, and especially India, the time zone difference. I remember I had to get in 8 a.m. every day to spend 3.5 to 4 hours on Skype, and they were already at 5:30. So their schedules was also weird because they were like rolling to work at 11 India time in the morning, and then stay until like 9. And in my 7 month there, I went to Pune 3 times. Each spent a week there because every time we have like write up a bunch of specs and brainstorm, and you're like locked the dev leads in the room and talk through it for a week, try to jam as much as possible. It was not ideal. From like founders starting companies to people working, going to be an engineering team, ideally you want to be in the same place with your product manager, the designers that you're collaborating with, ideally also the stakeholders, because we've considered at Blue Apron at some point like, oh, maybe we'll open an Austin office because we established a customer service team in Austin, or San Francisco office, but it was really, really tough because you don't want to have a PM who's not located in the same place. It just doesn't create the same kind of collaboration. And my personal philosophy from a product management perspective is that PMs, sure, they're ultimately responsible for a lot of the overall performance and the launch of the product, the quality, but ideas come from everywhere, and having close collaboration with the engineering team at the very, very early stage of concepting is extremely important. And for PMs who like to, here's a spec, I'm like lock myself in a room and here you go, like that kind of assembly line process, I don't think creates the ideal experience because people are not bought in, and teams who are actually engineers and designers working on this stuff are not as looped in terms of like, what is the origin of this idea, and like, what do we want to actually create for the customers? So, I mean, I think we got by for Fab, and it had a specific reason why it was done that way, but I would not recommend either as a PM or an engineer to work separate with your core team, because I just don't think it's an ideal experience. Yeah.
I was hoping you could talk a little bit about some of the products that you launched while at Blue Apron and the process of that, and also like the things that you were excited about that like changed their model has evolved a little bit, and it's pretty fascinating. So.
Yeah. So I'll go back to like earlier part of my tenure at Blue Apron when I was still PMing stuff. I'd say the last year and a half to 2 years, I was more kind of department leader. So I haven't really written a spec for almost 2 years, although I would still review a lot of kind of obviously responsible for higher level roadmap and directions. I'd say the thing, if I have to pick something that I launched that I thought was the most satisfying for myself was our first version of our iOS app. Blue Apron didn't really have an iOS app for 2 years. I joined a year and a half in, and I joined in February 2014. We decided that, we finally have some time and mental bandwidth to think about native experience, and that was September of 14. Took me 3 months to scope it and design, and we didn't have designers, so I was doubly as UX. And start developing. First sprint was December of 14. We launched July 15 the following year, so it was a solid 6 months. We didn't have an in-house iOS team. Had to go work with an engineering team that was a dev shop essentially, and also to have an in-house design team. And so I had to work with another in-house outsourced design team, but we have our API backend engineer because the logic was all shared. That was a very satisfying experience for me, but it was a really, really large in scope because we didn't have a native app. And worse is like we don't have any client engineers, and I've never built an iOS app. I have zero background in native. A lot of I was obviously used iPhones, but so I have some user empathy from that. But that was it was challenging, with the outsourced nature and coordinating. Design firm that was outside, client-side team was outside, API engineer. We had also Blue Apron at the time. We didn't even have to write, we didn't have like a standard for APIs. We were a bunch of spaghetti code, and then we try to build slightly more modern web architecture on top of that. So we finally started thinking about like, what is our API standard? And engineering team at the time was about 20 people. And we didn't have like technical architecture review process. We didn't have like any kind of like committee. We didn't have senior kind of staff engineer type technical leadership say, here's how you should write APIs, this is how you document it, this is how you should do version control. So it was really a hot mess, and I worked with 3 different senior backend engineers. We're a Rails shop. Senior backend engineers who were passing the baton to each other. It's like, I got to go on some other project goodbye. And here's like, like I was the only one who actually knew end-to-end what we're trying to develop, which was very challenging. And launching something completely brand new into a new operating system is also really tough. One of the toughest things was really coordinating, like the web mentality and the mobile team, and making sure people understand like how to scale the engineer organization once you have multiple clients sitting on top of the same set of essentially backend logic. For Blue Apron, that's really important because if you think you're getting a box on Wednesday and we shipped your box on Thursday, we're going to be really, really pissed at us because you rely on it for dinner and the food is perishable. So the change like that, like I remember when we launched the iOS app July of 15, and then the web team didn't know, well, like they haven't really built the muscle memory of, we now have a separate client app. We've got to be careful with making any kind of backend changes. And then it makes some stupid change. We're also launching Wine as a new product that we're rolling out. And I remember when a wine product, subscription product rolled out in September, there is this, the orders API didn't really differentiate between wine and meals. And then the mobile app was designed in such a way that consumes that backend logic, and then the web app was designed in some other way. So the iOS app basically went down for a day once we roll out Wine. And everybody's freaking out. And that kind of thing is just like kind of growing pains. You have to really, you're not going to anticipate. The reality is you just have to be able to kind of roll with the punches and quickly develop a process in a way the organization can continue to adapt. But from another very different product that I worked on would be something like what we internally called a shipping dashboard. This is kind of like a warehouse management system software, but calling it WMS is even probably too glorifying. Essentially, we had this fulfillment process in Blue Apron. For those who don't know, we send pre-portioned ingredients with chef-designed in-house recipes. So, if you think about it, I don't know how many of you have seen a traditional pick and pack e-commerce operation, but for like an Amazon warehouse, you have aisles and aisles of stuff that mapped into a specific location. And you have a person who go pick a bunch of different orders that came down from the consumer side. And then the WMS basically is queued up, and if it's smart, like tells you, go to aisle 2, pick this one item that's in one of the 16 orders and optimize some kind of route. And you pick at everything, and you roll this little giant cart to the labeling station. You pack them into boxes, maybe some smart software that dictates like what kind of box size you need, and it like seal it, print a FedEx level that matches the order ID, and then off you go. So like that's kind of like a traditional fulfillment process, and there are a lot of out-of-box software you can use for that. But for Blue Apron, it's almost more like a manufacturing and assembling process because you have like a little slice of ginger. We have to slice it, and we have to put it in a bag and stick a label on it that says, here's ginger. Well, now we don't do that manually anymore. We have machines that actually kind of seal it automatically and print the label on top. And then you have these assembling processes that put the stuff together. So long story short, it's a very custom way of producing. It's like producing 200 different styles of Toyota car, but you change the model every week. And you make the parts in your own facility as well. So this little thing that I built called Shipping Dashboard, there's this process at the end of once we packed all the boxes, we have to count and make sure that all the boxes are packed. We have 100 things we need to pack. Let's make sure 100 things are packed, and then have labels on them so that all the customers who were promised are going to get food and going to get food. And it was literally done in this like manual process. There's this sheet that someone would print out and fill in the count. You would literally stand there and count how many boxes are on a pallet and how many pallets I have to make sure that we have everything that's accounted for. And one day we're like, okay, well, this is breaking down. And I still have that sheet that says 133 orders. This is a long time ago. we decided that we need to build software to have some kind of verification. Think about validation, right? This is essentially trying to put in some validation in the offline process to really tighten things up across multiple fulfillment centers. And that's a very different type of product experience because you're building software that's more like systems, and you're trying to map offline and online process together. But you have to, the user empathy you have to apply is also very different because these are fulfillment center employees who are standing there for 8-hour shifts in a refrigerated environment, and they're getting yelled at for wanting to get the boxes out of the door. So the kind of scoping process and the type of development process is very, very, very different from building a user and consumer-facing software like an iOS app. It's probably more than what you wanted to hear, but.
So can you tell us a little bit more about the PM role in general? So what exactly that would break down into? Because you mentioned scoping a couple of times and speccing, and it's not something I'm familiar with.
Yeah.
And then also what sort of preparation, sort of in the lead up to your first PM role that you feel like was the most valuable in retrospect?
Okay, so two-part question. So what is a product manager? Before I try to give an answer to that, I want to caution that every company's product management role is going to be a little different, because if you think about engineering is a discipline that is, had a very, very specific definition. You write code, you create things, and you develop logic, and you develop software that kind of thinks itself on its own. Design is also very specific. Marketing, operation. Product management is like you have all these circles, and you got shit to do in this giant space. Whatever that's white space that you need to fill, you got to find someone who can fill it. That's basically what product management is to an extreme version of describing it. So that's why, because every company's white space is going to be a little different. So I want to caution that I would go on to describe kind of Blue Apron's version of product management and what I looked for when I was hiring and how we built the team, but that's going to sound probably very different than Facebook's product management or Amazon's product management. In fact, I know these three are very different archetypes. But in general, my expectation of a product manager is someone who is taking ownership and responsibility for the end-to-end of the software experience. So from the end is okay, what is the business objective? But then what does the user need? And what are the other, what is technically feasible? What does the user actually want? And what actually match business goals? And these are all going to be push and pulls for each of these three corners. And the PM needs to figure out what is the solution that makes the right trade-off decisions, and then work all the way backwards and say, okay, so now I need to design this thing. By designing, I didn't mean to pull out Photoshop or Sketch. I meant, okay, what are the requirements and what are the functionality that need to exist? Why does it exist right now? Why does it not need to exist right now? What are the types of bandwidth we have as a company? How do I best spend resource? Kind of like a resource allocation. And then and the reason I say it's white space, let's say my counterpart is an engineer manager who is extremely brilliant in front end and user experience, and I've worked with someone like that who is still at Blue Apron. In that case, I can spend less time focusing on defining the actual user experience, spend more time on stuff that he's not nearly as good at or he doesn't want to spend time on, like herding the cats on the stakeholder side, negotiating with all of them, figuring out reporting, actually defining, if he's here, just give me something really, really rough, and I'll figure it out exactly what we need to do here. I don't need step-by-step, user experience mock-ups for how this whole thing's going to interact. Literally, what happens after you pull down the drop-down. Then, but you can also run into some other engineering team who is I literally need you to define it because either I don't want to take responsibility for it or that I don't want to spend my headspace thinking about it. So it really flexes ebb and flow and depends on what kind of engineering team you're working with. So as a product manager, I think you need to be able to flex up and down and really look around and say here's what my designer is good at, this is what my engineering team is good at, or this is the stuff that they like to spend time on. So I'm going to like take care of everything else that is required all the way to launching something that makes the business impact you really want to make, satisfy the user needs and make them happy. At the same time, fully leverage, if not taking full consideration of the technical feasibility and consideration. So that's like a very abstract way of like describing product management, but specifically like how they spend time, you'll see a lot of product managers in meetings all the time. They need to study up. I fully expect them to really understand the customers. Not to say that that's, PMs are the only people who need to understand customers. In fact, everybody on the team should really understand the users that you're targeting and empathize with them. What are they struggling with? What are their needs are? I also really think that everybody should have a really basic understanding of the business objectives. How do we think about the business goals? How do we measure it? What are the metrics? Sure, I'll quiz the PM for like, hey, how are the KPIs looking? But I think it's a much more productive relationship for everybody from designers to engineers to also have the same, good fluency in terms of those considerations. Because otherwise, you will probably find yourself not buying into the decisions that are made, or like, well, why are we doing this? I think that really reduces the friction in terms of how you collaborate. And then PMs are responsible for making sure things happen on time, communicating, tons of communicating. Well, why are we late? Okay, because of X, Y, Z. Oh, we designed a spec this way, but now we're running into the snafu because, a bunch of spaghetti callbacks is taking longer to actually figure out how we solve it. And then to make trade-off decisions on the fly, and as a result, communicate it back to the company, the stakeholders, like why things are happening X, Y, Z way, training this customer experience team. Like, you're launching something, you got to equip them with knowledge of how to roll it out. For Blue Apron specifically, we also have to deal with a lot of cross-functional lockstep launches. Like iOS app is like a much less applicable example for that, but a shipping dashboard is, because you need to make sure all the fulfillment centers understand that we're launching this. How are we going to roll into their training modules? How are we going to like hand-holding them? How are we going to like get feedback for something like we're launching a wine subscription program? Well, okay, it's not just a digital software. That's a key component of it. But for like how the boxes get shipped out, what is the design of the wine? How do we communicate in that? Like that's across like 15 different operating teams at the company, and that's in my mind the PM's job to make sure, even if it's not just a purely physical software, digital product, you really need to make sure that you can't be like, well, that's I don't run the CX team. I was like, well, then why are you launching this time? You need to make sure the CX team is on board and the operations team is on board. So those are like kind of the major areas of responsibility, but at a very abstract level, ultimately responsible for end-to-end, from understanding what problems we're solving, work backwards to solve those. And then once you launch, this is also something that more junior PMs are not necessarily good at, is you launch something, you're always launching a V1, well, that's not good. You launch a first iteration because you want to put it out in the market to then understand the hypotheses that you had up front and whether they're proved or disproved. And if you kind of have to, like, when you scope, like, what constitutes a V1, you can do the whole full-on sandwich, or you can cut it and you do half of it. But that decision of, like, what do we actually want to spend resources building now? What do we have high confidence in? What do we have low confidence in? How am I going to ever like close the loop? And the loop never fully closed because you put something out and you understand what's happening, and then you iterate, and you have a consistent goal setting and have a consistent way of like, hey, checking back, this is how we're improving the experience, and how are we getting closer to the objective that we initially set out. So, and in terms of like preparing for it, I usually describe the skill set. If you think of a Venn diagram of 3 circles, I usually describe skill set as, first area is, I generally describe as like business acumen and data analytical chops, because to understand the business needs and at a high level, let's say Blue Apron, like what is our strategy? How does the financial look like? What is our business model? How do we make money? What is our addressable market? How big is the user audience right now? How do we continue to expand? What are they happy with and unhappy with? Pricing, all this other stuff. A lot of times you have to deal with these types of questions. So having a baseline fluency with general business concepts, and that doesn't mean that you have to have an MBA or even have any form of business training. but I do think you need to be really comfortable with data and manipulating data and be resourceful at pulling and making sense of it. So that's one area. The second area is user experience sensibility. The reason I call it sensibility versus design chops is because you don't have to be a designer, but you do have to have good judgment. You have to say, ideally you see something and you imagine how users interact, and you say, oh, this is where they're going to get tripped. Or high level of standards when it comes to user experience, and say, well, that's off by 2 pixels, and that's not good because that's not polished. And that kind of like ability to have a conversation with the design team and draw the best out of them. The third area is technical fluency. And I personally don't have a CS background, nor have I had any kind of training like this. I finished 2 Code Academy classes. That's about it in terms of front end. I stopped halfway in JavaScript. But I will say, though, that the HTML CSS training was helpful because I can just open the Chrome inspector and just mess around. And I can have some basic conversation with the engineering team starting at the front end, which is the presentation layer. And that was very, very helpful for me. The other thing that was really helpful for me was I learned SQL. With SQL, you understand, first of all, you can pull data, so you're useful. So you don't bother an engineer when they need to write code and hey, can you pull X, Y, Z for me? Well, just go navigate the schema and see, just look at a schema mapping and have a basic understanding of how your software looks like, and be able to have more of the back-end conversations with the engineering team. But I think technical fluency is really about very, very high-level concepts of how modern web development and software development works, and really be able to be inquisitive and be empathetic and ask questions and listen to the engineering team. So I say most PMs come from one of these 3 circles, and then they eventually grow into the 2 others. So I came from more of a business background, but developed kind of my sensibility in the 2 other areas. In terms of what I actually prepare for, I didn't really do much other than trying to jam SQL in 3 days, because I was interviewing for the PM role at Fab, and I saw one of the bullet points says SQL knowledge preferred. I was like, oh, I don't know what this is, but let me just look up some class online. I remember it was a Stanford database class, so I just watched all the videos and wrote a bunch of select where. And I was like, okay, I'm ready for the interview. I never got quizzed, but once I started the job, Fab at the time didn't really have self-serve. It didn't really have a full-on BI analytics team. So it was really helpful because I need to immediately use that to answer my own questions.
So you mentioned just a minute ago the way that you communicated with developers and how it's really important to talk to engineers. What would be your advice for new engineers for communicating their work to PMs or to other people in the company effectively, or maybe traits you've seen in engineers that we could learn from?
I think so. I think first get to know your teammates, and you should think the product managers you work with, there's your teammates, designers you work with, there's your teammates, and understanding what the PM is good at and what the PM is not good at. Because it's the white space thing, right? You let them know, hey, this is what I like to do, spend my time on. This is what I like to learn from you. This is what you should learn from me, and this is how we should. I think getting to know each other at a skill set level, at an experience level, as well as personally, really helps having conversations. One of the things that's going to be toughest for engineering team working with the PMs in general is estimating. It's oh, how long is it going to take? I'm I don't know. I've never run into an engineer manager, VP of Eng who's I'm really good at estimating. I've never heard that. So if you're good at that, you should get a job that pay you $500,000 because I think it's worth it. Especially for young engineers, and especially for someone who's not familiar with the code base, one advice I have is especially when you're not familiar with the code base, regardless of your skill set level, whatever the heck company you're going to join, is mostly going to be a bunch of crazy ass stuff in the code base. And you can't expect everything to be elegantly written. There's zero documentation. If you're working at any company, I mean, even like really mature companies, because they have like really old stuff in the code base that has not been replaced or rewritten. So I will always like just double your estimation, just double it, because like shit is gonna happen, and you're gonna get sick, you know, you're gonna like get tripped, you're gonna get distracted, whatever. Like it just always double it, because and like establishing some baseline credibility with stakeholders and PMs. PMs is like a lot of times it's just like in between, eventually to a stakeholder, right? And they get a lot of pressure because everybody's screaming at them and say, hey, where's the stuff? Where's my stuff? Where's the stuff I need to sell to customers? Where's the stuff I promised our CEOs? This is on the roadmap, yada, yada, yada. So they also, you have to empathize with them that they're also taking a lot of crap from other people. And so they come back at you and be like, okay, this is like, we got to figure out collectively. And they have they have all the intention or incentivized to really work with you, try to figure out what do you need from me in order for you to let me know how we're going to go about doing this. So I think, you know, over-communicate is always better than under-communicate, and always let your PM know, like, hey, what are, you know, some PMs are good at it, and be like, hey, what are the blockers? Like, how can I help you? Are you getting distracted? Is your PR not getting reviewed? Has it been, and sometimes even like I these days run into, like right before I left, I was talking to a senior engineer at Blue Apron, engineer number 2, and he was working on this thing for a hackathon that we voted number 1, so we're gonna roll it out to production. And I was like, hey Alex, how's that thing going? Because I'm personally really excited about it. He's like, oh, you know, it's being, you know, waiting, I need a PR review. I was like, how long have you been waiting for the PR review? He's like, oh, 2 weeks. I was like, what? Why are you waiting for a PR review for 2 weeks? He's like, well, it's like complicated. It's like, now we have about 80% engineering team. He's on like no longer on the consumer team, even though it's a consumer feature. And he's facing the barriers of like, oh, I'm gonna go bother someone else, who's gonna get someone else to review it, yada, yada, yada. I was like, well, that kind of stuff, you know, the PM who's working with you on it can go nuts for you, right? Like, that kind of stuff is very easy, and PM's role is to remove blockers. But they won't know it's a blocker until you tell them, right? So a lot of smarter ones would be like using a daily stand-up. I would use stand-ups to hear things and try to make sure I hear everything I'm supposed to be hearing. And if I don't hear it, I was like, oh, well, didn't you say that we were gonna like do this? I was like, oh yeah, but like this and that happened. I was like, oh, well, let me go fix it for you. And the thing that everything I like to know as a PM, like everything I can do to remove blockers for you, because the faster the stuff launched, the happier we all are. So I think that's one key thing that, you know, don't be shy of surfacing things that, you know, your teammates, especially the product manager, can be helpful for you, because that's their job.
So from your perspective as a PM, what's been more effective in driving business value or like additional business value, right? Is it either speed to market or quality of your product?
So before I answer that, it's interesting because every company, I think every company at some point in its journey needs to define where the spectrum do you want to live. So you mentioned the two ends of the spectrum. One is quality, or I call it polish. One is speed. We all know where Facebook used to live. You know, move fast and break things. So all the way on this side of the spectrum. Now I don't know what they say now. Move fast and like try not to break things. One day, I don't think Blue Apron during my tenure has, actively tried to define where we are. I think we're like all the way here. However, I had a conversation with our CTO founder, who's my boss, very recently, right before I left, and I was like, we need to define where we'd like to sit, because I was like, where do you want to pick? He's like, well, I want things to launch as fast as possible and be perfect. I was like, well, you can't have the cake and eat it too. You got to choose, because otherwise people on the team are going to be confused. Are we going to try to like noodle on it forever? You can have very high polish bar that literally require 2 more sprints for you to launch stuff, right? Is this, this modal in one of the 5 edge cases that's only going to be seen by 1% of the users, that has like the old style, or is not perfectly aligned, or in an iPad breakpoint, it just looks bizarre. Okay, that's like all the way here. but some like other more, like how do you as a team and as a team, a product leader or engineer leader, both actually, and design leader, the three pronouns need to collectively define where we'd like to sit and what does that mean? Like what is our polish bar and what is production worthy and what is not? Everything below that, we need to go back into QA. So now back to your question, after hopefully you have, this stuff is going to take time to iterate, right? Because nobody knows. And I think it a little bit depends on the specific situation for the company. Use Blue Apron as an example. Most of the time, we sit here for a few reasons. One, because we're a consumer-facing brand. Trust is very important. We're not a commoditized offering. We think we're selling an experience. If we're selling an experience, well, the experience can look crap, so it has to be somewhere over here because it conveys. We're also not, a Walmart pricing. We're not Louis Vuitton, but we're probably like Starbucks, right? So like we can have stuff that looks, crappy and want to charge Starbucks pricing or Louis Vuitton pricing. So I think that really has to match to like what your offering looks like. However, if you're like, okay, you're a Series A startup, you're 3 months from running out of cash, and you're depending on this thing has to launch, and because you got to get 5 people on the investor pitch deck to do a Series A extension or a Series B that are committed to the next iteration of product, well, then just get the stuff out, right? Do everything you can to get the stuff out, come back to rewrite it. It could be like a piece of crap, it's okay. So I think it's a little bit situational, but I think it's, philosophically speaking, I do think it's important for companies to try to like gradually define, kind of like how you define your mission and vision and your values, where you should actually like to sit.
Do you believe that being a great product manager leads to someone who could become a great founder? Like, do you believe that those are similar traits that they?
I would not say a blanket statement yes. How I would answer that question is, generally, like say if you're going to be a founder, you would need to kind of know a little bit of everything, right? Because even if you're not going to run product, engineering, operations, marketing, HR, finance, you would need to identify talent who can do that eventually. And at the very, very early stage, you kind of have to do that on your own. You have a co-founder who might be complementary to certain of those functional skill set, but a lot of the early days, you don't have the only arbitrage you get. You don't have an arbitrage opportunity. You like try to sell your equity to be worth something, to hire people, to then get the talent bar you need to execute. So I would say, with that framework in mind, anything that exposes you to a lot of different functional areas is a good experience to have as a founder. Now, if you're eventually going to start something that's technology-enabled or a software company, PM is a good training ground because it naturally exposes you to all sorts of stuff that happens at a company. Blue Apron is a technology-enabled business, and through my experience when I was doing IC work, individual contributor work, I had to deal, I had to launch a new Zen. I remember I was like migrating user voice to Zendesk. So I set up our call customer service operation. I worked on a bunch of fulfillment tools. I understand how fulfillment process and supply chain and sourcing works. Obviously worked on some of the consumer-facing stuff. So I also know how to think about growth and acquisition and what is the CPA we're paying. How do we think about payback? What is the LTV target? How do we think about segmentation? I have to pull my own data, and so that I have very good analytics understanding and naturally exposed to finance as well, and obviously engineering and design. So I think it's the closest to a general management role without actually being a general management. Like, here's your P&L, there's a bunch of people. Because general managers also don't really exist unless you're at a really big company. A close proxy, like product management actually came from this concept of brand managers from CPG companies before software is a thing, because that's kind of how they also thought about like general management. So you're like a brand manager of Tide. It gives you a really good training of all the stuff that you need to know from logistics and fulfillment to brand. So I think that would be something to keep in mind. However, I would say that if you're even if you're in an engineering management position or just a if you want to go to the individual contributor track and be a staff engineer eventually versus having to be a EM and manage people, I also think there's tons of opportunities to step up and get the same amount of exposure. You probably won't get nearly as much of like the soft skills that's required, meaning like you're not going to be the primary person who's like having to herd a bunch of cats. However, we all, like at Blue Apron, we encourage, like we set up these teams called squads, and we have a PM leader, an eng manager leader, and the stakeholder, for example, the growth team, is the EM, the PM, and the marketing lead, the acquisition lead. And they three need to figure out how to get users. So if the EM is interested and can operate in that fashion, most of the time our EM happens to be able to do that, being a very business fluent EM, he'd be in meetings with our PM all the time. I mean, he obviously feels a lot more like technical questions and like how long does thing take, your favorite question, but like I think that exposure is something that you can definitely seek without having to actually take the product management role. And the other thing I would say, if you join a company early, one of my PMs who's now back to engineering because he's like writing code more, but he was engineer number 1 at Blue Apron, and a year in, he's like, I want to be a product manager. He actually didn't have CS training. He was an NYU Stern undergrad, and then he did a coding school, not Flatiron, and somewhere else, and then he became an engineer. And then he did engineering thing for a while, and then said he wanted to be a PM, and he's now back at engineering. But that also happens a lot because he understands our business, he understands our user. So it's a really fairly straightforward transition for him. Obviously, he has a bunch of stuff to learn, but that could also happen.
It's kind of a general question, but like, what was it like being a PM during like a company's IPO?
IPO as a process is very distracting for everybody. I think it doesn't, the stuff that kind of, the impact that it has is more general to everybody, less so than a PM. Like what I would say about, the product team is that we didn't really, we do 6-month roadmap planning. We don't do yearly because, we try to think long term, but even we're a public company, or Blue Apron is a public company now, is still a very, very early stage for the company. It's only 5 years old. So things still move a lot, and I don't do yearly planning because 6 months from now, things will look completely different externally, internally, our objectives, and also if we're bad at estimating, the margin of error, like the statistical error, is just going to stack up, and stuff that a year from now, 6 months from now, is not going to make much sense. So the only thing I would say about that is that we didn't really scope the roadmap, say like, oh, we're going to have an IPO. And also the other thing is that internal communication-wise, we couldn't really talk about it with the employees until the confidential S1 was filed. So we only had about like 2-month window where everybody knew that this was about to happen. Actually, only a month. So it really didn't impact kind of everybody in the front line as much. At the more senior level, obviously you kind of know that's happening, and the stuff that it'd be top of my mind is like trying to develop our culture and our process so that we're not thrashing people. Because once we're public, you have quarterly financial pressure. How do we make sure that we have the mechanism in place so that we can continue to stay focused on the long term? It's extremely hard, and I don't think Blue Apron has figured it out completely, but those are all the things that are top of mind for senior leaders at the time for the companies going public. I think people on the front line also had a lot of worries about, well, are we going to be pressured into doing short-term stuff? I think most companies' management team, they're prudent. They want to make sure they invest mental bandwidth in like developing a culture to prevent that. However, I would say it is a lot of daily distraction, the stock price and this and that, and I think it requires a different level of financial discipline and higher level of process across the organization. And that might not be something that people like to see, especially for folks who joined very, very early, when it was a completely different kind of culture and sentiment.
So you were one of the first, you were in a year and a half to Blue Apron. and you were the first on the product team, you said. So filling white spaces, as you said a few times as a product manager, what is the tension like between the founders, whoever hired you, and then you are suddenly filling all these spaces? You're given so much responsibility, or you have so much responsibility, or you take on so much responsibility, and relinquishing that would seem difficult to me.
Yeah. So a little bit of both. So a little bit of like kind of both sides of the spectrum. On the one end, companies want to hire a PM because there's like things are out of control. Like when I remember I started on the Friday and they were launching what we called meal configurations. Blue Apron before that launch only offered the omnivore recipe combo of 3 recipes or the completely vegetarian one. You couldn't choose. It's just like that or that, the end. So we're about to launch, hey, you finally have 5 combinations. You can tell us you don't eat beef. We'll never send you beef and that kind of stuff. And I remember I had my first CTO founder, who's my manager, is like, okay, well, help us launch this. And I was like looking at the spec, which was like PowerPoint slides with, I think like screenshots of our existing experience with like little annotation boxes. And then it was emailing out to all 3 founders, plus our director of marketing, plus our director of operations. I don't understand why he was like looking at that. And plus our engineer, the engineer number 1 I mentioned, who was acting as a PM. And then everybody was piling to the email chain of like, this is what I think, page 2 is like, da 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 da. It's like insane. And it's probably why they decided they need a product manager, because that's not how you run the review process. So from that angle is a breath of fresh air. The roadmap, we don't have a roadmap. What I saw first day joining, along with the other PM, joined at the same time as me, who's now our director of WMS product, it was just like Google spreadsheet, a wish list from the marketing team, the ops team, this and that. Like, oh, we should build this tool. Like stakeholders love to jump directly to solutions. Like, we want this. It was like, well, hold on. What is the problem we're trying to solve? Why is this problem more important than that problem? How do we even think about that? And like this thing, why are you so sure that this is a thing that we want to build? So like that kind of framework of thinking also didn't exist. And they're just like, well, that feels like top of the roadmap. And literally the first 6 months was just like, all right, me and Dan, we're each going to take 3, and we're just going to go at it. And then eventually we develop more of a, hey, here's how we should think about roadmap planning. Here are the KPIs. Why are these the KPIs? Why are these not the KPIs? When there are things both feels equally important, how do we go about deciding which one is a priority? On the other hand, you're right. You know, I remember, so Matt, our CEO, he would want, he stopped reviewing my specs only about 2 years ago. So I would print out these like wireframes that I make because we have designers. And he would ask me to print out this like large print. And he's like, well, Melody, I want like a printout of the specs and I want to like comment on it. And he would literally be like, oh, he's not a designer by training. He doesn't have any products and 0. And he would be like, well, why does interaction need to look like this? And then we eventually stopped him from that kind of, micro commenting of user experience, but I'll tell you, it continues to be a challenge, especially for founders, who, whether someone has, user experience design or product background or not, now we have, right before I left, my director of product design, a very seasoned design leader. My director of consumer product, very seasoned product leader, came from Foursquare, was heading their entire product team, and the design leader came from ZocDoc, was heading their user experience and creative team. And I'll send these 2, and he would be like, well, I want to see the sign-up flow. I was like, why do you want to see the sign-up flow? And then he's just, in his mind, he just thinks that like something is not working or somehow. So I send them to like walk him through it, but also more importantly, educate him on the process of how you hire very smart people. And this is like what they're trained to do. And this is like a process. We have daily reviews. We do this, we do that, to like get him more comfortable around it. But it's a process. And I've heard like, I will get personally frustrated at times of like, why is this like, this kind of like random comments coming in all the time? But I think almost every company has that. And like some slightly different format, and CEO and or founders get hung up on that kind of thing for a while before they fully relinquish control. And the other thing I would say is that stakeholders, before they, product managers existed, marketing team, for example, is a lot of marketing team and product teams always, for B2C companies, marketing and product is like always never get along. For SaaS companies, sales and product never get along. And our ops and WMS product never get along. I mean, for us, actually, the design, engineering, product team is very harmonious. Other companies you'll see engineering and product don't get along, product design don't get along. Nobody gets along with anybody else, apparently. But at Blue Apron, marketing was a big challenge for us early days because before product manager existed, they were like, whoa, why does this button look like this? Why does it like jumps to solutions, want to like hijack the roadmap all the time? And they don't understand because they don't understand how software is built. They're like, oh, we just signed a deal with Top Chef, and we need a landing page tomorrow. I was like, oh, you go build that. I don't, I can't build a landing page. And like this kind of stuff happens all the time, and it requires constant training. And as a leader for the team is like tons of like educating and negotiating and eventually let them understand like, this is like, oh, there's a sprint and it takes 2 weeks and we plan it. And then once you're like in it, we don't want to interrupt people because it's like distraction, it's a waste of time, and they're not going to get happy, and they're going to quit, and if they all quit, we get nothing done, so we don't want that. So that's like actually like, can you figure out your needs like a month? Well, actually, can we figure out brainstorming sessions together where we roadmap plan 6 months? Because we should be able to think through that versus like, oh, we need a landing page tomorrow because we signed a deal 3 months ago, forgot to tell you guys. So like, I think but that's a tendency you'll see. And when PMs don't do a good job filtering that and or devising a mechanism for collaboration, engineers get hit on a daily basis. And it really impacts morale and impacts your happiness working there.
Cool. I think we can then wrap it up. Thank you so much, Melody. I'll come stand up awkwardly. Lovely.